want to start with a man on a backhoe who thought he had found a crime scene. It's 1982, in a place called Titusville, Florida, right on the Space Coast, a few miles from where the shuttles went up. A developer is building a subdivision called Windover Farms, and there's a shallow, muddy pond in the way. The plan is to drain it and turn it into a retention basin. So an operator named Steve Vanderjagt climbs into the cab and starts pulling the muck out, bucket by bucket. And on one of those passes, the bucket comes up full of skulls. Human skulls, not one. Several tangled in the black peat, staring back at him out of the ground. And I want you to sit in that moment with him, because he doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know how old they are. All he knows is that he is standing over a pond full of dead people in a quiet Florida suburb. And the first thought any sane person has is not archaeology, it's murder. That's exactly how it was treated. This was 1982, remember. A pond full of human skulls in a residential development is not an archaeology story yet. It's a police story. The remains went to the county, and the medical examiner's office started the way they would with any mass grave, as a possible homicide. Someone had to answer the obvious questions. How many people were down there? How long had they been in the water? And whether there was somebody, somewhere, who had put them there and needed finding. So picture the actual scene. Construction halls. A quiet suburban lot on the Space Coast becomes for a little while a suspected crime scene. People standing around a drained pond trying to work out whether they're looking at a killer's dumping ground. That's the frame everyone brought to it, because it's the only frame that made sense. Bodies in water means something went wrong. Bodies in water means somebody did something. But the how long ago question wouldn't behave. The bone was wrong. It wasn't decades old. Not a missing persons case someone could still be charged for. Not anything a detective could work. It was ancient. And yet it was also far too intact to be as old as it plainly was. That contradiction, too old to be a crime, too preserved to be that old, is the exact knot that pulls the whole story open. Because when the examiner finally understood what was lying at the bottom of that pond, the truth turned out to be stranger than any murder anyone could have committed. Every single person in that hole had been dead for 7,000 years. And most of the story I'm about to tell you, nobody standing at that pond in 1982 could have imagined. Least of all what was still sitting, intact, inside their heads. 7,000 years. I need you to sit with that number, because our minds are genuinely bad at it, and until you feel the size of it, the rest of this won't land. Let me put it in things you already know. When these people were being lowered into that pond, there were no pyramids anywhere on Earth. Egypt was still 2, maybe 3,000 years away from stacking the first block at Giza. Stonehenge did not exist. Not even the earliest ditch. Writing did not exist. Not in Sumer, not in Egypt, not anywhere. Nobody on the planet had yet worked out how to make a mark that meant a word. The wheel had not been invented. Bronze was thousands of years off. These people lived and died in a world with no written language, no metal, no cities. And they are among the oldest human beings ever recovered anywhere on the North American continent. So the mind wants to file them under primitive and move on. Cavemen, blank faces. And that instinct is going to be wrong in almost every way that matters, which is part of what makes this so unsettling. But hold that for now. The point right now is just the depth of time, because that depth is what makes a body an impossibility. And here is the part that should not be possible. Florida destroys the dead. The soil across most of the state is acidic and hot and wet, and it eats organic material. It eats bone. Archaeologists working in Florida are used to finding almost nothing because the ground dissolves it. A skeleton from a few centuries ago can be gone. So the idea that a pond off Interstate 95 was holding intact human beings from before the invention of the written word, that alone breaks the rules of the place. So already, before anyone opens anything, the pond is breaking rules. Ancient bones, whole and articulated. Some skeletons still had bones connected to bones, held in their proper places, after 7,000 years, in the one kind of ground that's supposed to make that impossible. If the story stopped right here, it would already be one of the most important archaeological sites ever found on the continent, purely for the age and the completeness. But intact skeletons aren't even the strange part. I keep circling the skeletons because I'm not ready to say the real thing yet. Because when the scientists finally lifted those skulls out of the water and looked inside them, what they found does not belong to this world by any timeline we understand, and I'll get there. I promise I'll get there. But first, you have to know who these people were, because everything that's about to come out of those skulls only means what it means once you understand the care with which they went into the ground. Between 1984 and 1986, after the funding finally came through, a Florida State University archaeologist named Glenn Doran took over that pond. 3 field seasons. What his teams pulled out of the peat is, to this day, the largest and most complete population of ancient people ever found from that era anywhere in the Americas. A minimum of 168 individuals. And this is the detail that gets me. The one I can't shake. It wasn't warriors. It wasn't a plague pit or a battlefield or the losers of some massacre. It was everybody. Newborns who lived a matter of days, toddlers, teenagers, adults in the middle of their lives, people over 65, which in the archaic period is genuinely, remarkably old. That's someone who survived everything the ancient world could throw at a body and died of nothing but time. Men and women in almost exactly equal number. Every stage a human life passes through is represented in that water. That completeness is its own kind of evidence. A community that buries its stillborn infants in the same sacred place as its elders, with the same care, over hundreds of years, is not a band scraping to survive. It's a people with a settled idea of who belongs to them and where their dead are supposed to go. Archaeologists will tell you this is one of the most demographically complete populations from this depth of time found anywhere in the Americas, and that completeness is exactly why we can say so much about how they lived. But the number that stays with me isn't a statistic. It's that when I read the list of ages, it reads like any town's. The very old and the newborn, resting in the same ground. So who were they? Nomadic people, following the Florida peninsula on foot, hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons. And the easy thing, the wrong thing, is to picture them as primitive, crude, barely hanging on. I want to kill that picture right now because nothing they left behind supports it. These were not desperate people flinging their dead into a swamp. Watch what they actually did. They laid each body on its left side and drew the knees up toward the chest. The fetal position, the same shape every one of us comes into the world in. They turned the heads to the west and the faces to the north, every time. Not roughly, not randomly. The same orientation, again and again, across generations. The way a modern cemetery faces its graves a certain way, because that's simply how it's done. There was a right way to do this, and everyone knew it, and they held to it for century after century. And then there's the staking, which is the detail that convinced me these were not people improvising. A body placed in water wants to float, it will not stay where you put it. So they solved that. They cut branches, lashed them together, and pinned each person gently against the floor of the pond. Held down, held in place, so their dead would remain exactly where they'd been laid. That's not panic. That's not disposal. That's engineering, in service of tenderness. Somebody worked out how to keep the dead from drifting and did it for every single burial, so that the people they loved would stay put in the sacred water. This was a cemetery, designed, understood, and maintained across an almost unimaginable span of time by people who knew precisely where their dead belonged and made sure they stayed there. Then there's the cloth. And the cloth is where I stopped thinking of these people as strangers. Because wrapped around some of those bodies, preserved in the peat, was fabric, woven fabric, actual textile made on some kind of simple loom with techniques that have names, twining and true plain weave, the same over-under structure in the shirt you're wearing right now. This is the oldest woven cloth ever found in the Americas. Let me say that again, so it lands, because it rewrites a chapter of the textbook. Before Windover, the assumption was that this kind of weaving came to the continent far, far later. These fragments pushed that date back by thousands of years. When the specialists catalogued it, they found real sophistication, more than 80 pieces, different weaves with technical names, twining and balanced plain weave, made on some kind of simple frame or backstrap loom, bags, hoods, blankets, clothing. This was not a people who'd stumbled onto a scrap of fiber. This was a textile tradition, mature and practiced 7,000 years ago, in a place where nobody thought looms existed yet. And some of that cloth appears to have been made for one purpose only, to bury the dead, burial shrouds. They wove fabric specifically so that their people would not go into the water bare. Think about the labor in that. Spinning fiber and weaving cloth by hand is slow, patient, difficult work. And they spent it on the dead, on people who would never wear it in the world, who would only be seen in it by the ones lowering them down. You don't do that for a body you're discarding. You do it for someone you're sending off, and it gets more intimate than the shrouds, in a way that honestly stops me cold every time I come back to it. On some of the bodies, the fingers and the toes had been wrapped, separately, individually, one at a time. Somebody sat with the dead and wound fiber around each single finger, each single toe. Slowly, deliberately, the way you would bundle up a small child against the cold before sending them out on a long trip in winter. And the archaeologists who found it reached for exactly that image, unprompted, as if being prepared for a journey. Nobody wraps a body finger by finger unless they believe that body is going somewhere, and they want it warm when it gets there. The things they buried people with say the same thing, over and over. A woman in her early 20s went into the pond wearing 3 separate necklaces, one strung from fish vertebrae, one from the seeds of the sable palm, one from shell. 3. Someone chose them, made them, and put them on her. A 2-year-old, a toddler, was given a necklace too, draped over a body that had been in the world for barely more than 1,000 days. And with one man, they left an atlatl weight, a stone piece of an atlatl, the spear-throwing tool that was the height of technology in their world. But this one had been broken at some point in his life and carefully repaired and kept. And when he died, they placed that mended, well-used tool in the water with him. Glenn Doran's reading of that object is the one that haunts me most. It had been used in life. You can see the wear, the break, the repair, the whole biography of a thing a man relied on. And then someone made the decision that he would still need it. not as decoration, as equipment, for wherever he was going. Hold on to all of this. The wrapped fingers, the 3 necklaces, the child's necklace, the mended spear thrower given back to its owner in death, because in the very next breath it is going to collide, head on, with the single strangest thing ever lifted out of that pond. And the collision is the whole reason this story has never left me. So here's the moment. The crews are lifting these skulls out of the peat, cleaning them, and they notice that some of them aren't empty. There's a mass inside, a greasy, brownish lump filling the brain case. And the reasonable assumption, the one anybody would make, is that it's just peat, mud. The bog packed dirt up into the skull over 7,000 years. Of course it did. It wasn't mud. Somebody, though, had the presence of mind not to just scrape it out and throw it away. Instead, they treated it as a question. They took the intact skulls, still sealed, and sent them out for imaging. The same machines a hospital would use on you. X-ray first, then CT scans, then MRI. And the images came back showing something no one is supposed to see in a 7,000-year-old skull. Structure, recognizable structure, folds and features, and the general architecture of an organ, sitting in exactly the places that organ is supposed to sit. Then they went closer. They put the tissue under a microscope, and they could see cell walls, the outlines of individual cells, still holding their shape after 7,000 years in the dark. Not a stain, not a shadow. Cellular structure preserved. The lump inside those skulls was brain. Human brain tissue, 7,000 years old, shrunken down to about 1/3 of its living size. Yes, but there. Physically present, structurally intact, sliceable, readable. 91 of them. 91 preserved brains lifted out of a retention pond in suburban Florida from a time before writing, before the wheel, before the pyramids. I have to stop and say plainly how insane that is. We are not talking about bone, which is the hard, mineral, survivable part of us. We are talking about the softest tissue in the human body, the first thing to go. The thing that liquefies within days of death under normal conditions. And 91 of these people still had theirs. The oldest preserved human brains ever found in the Americas, and among the oldest anywhere on Earth. And then comes the detail that turns the science back into something human. For a brain to survive at all, the body has to get into that oxygen-free environment fast, within about 24 to 48 hours of death. Which means these weren't bodies that lay out for weeks. Every one of these people was carried to the water and placed in it within a day or two of dying. The preservation itself is proof of the care. The wrapped fingers, the shrouds, the speed, it's all the same act. They buried their dead quickly and gently, and that gentleness is the exact reason we can hold their minds in our hands 7,000 years later. Now I want to do the thing I always do, because I owe it to you. There's no curse here, no anomaly, no lost technology. Nothing supernatural came up out of that water. There is a real, physical, boring reason 91 brains survived, and I'm going to give it to you straight. It's the pond. The bodies were staked at the bottom of a peat bog. And peat does something very specific. It's layer upon layer of dead, waterlogged plant matter, packed down over ages. And the water trapped inside it goes anaerobic. It runs out of oxygen. That's the key that turns the lock. Decomposition, the normal rotting of a body, is mostly the work of bacteria. And those bacteria need oxygen to live. Take the oxygen away and you switch them off. The body stops breaking down because the things that break it down can't survive down there either. And Windover had a second piece of luck layered on top of the first. The water chemistry sat at a near neutral pH. Not the harsh acid that eats bone across the rest of Florida, but a rare, gentle balance that preserved instead of dissolved. Cold, still, dead, oxygen-starved water with just the right chemistry. That is the entire mechanism. No mystery ingredient. It's the same reason the famous bog bodies of Northern Europe, the ones in Denmark and Ireland with their skin intact, their faces intact, the stubble still on their chins 2,000 years later, come out of the peat looking like they died last month. Same physics, same still, sour, breathless water, doing the same impossible-looking thing. So there it is. Chemistry, not magic, and I could stop there and let it feel solved. But I'm not going to, because knowing how it happened does not make it smaller. It makes it worse in the best way, because it means this is real. There is nothing to disbelieve. A few feet under the water, off the side of an interstate, in a state that destroys the dead, the chemistry happened to be exactly, impossibly right. And it kept 168 people and 91 of their minds, waiting 7,000 years for a man on a backhoe to find them. The explanation doesn't close the mystery. It just tells you the mystery is true. And that intact tissue let the scientists do something they could never have done with bone alone. They pulled DNA out of the brains, genetic material 7,000 years old, sequenced from the minds of people who died before history began. And just being able to do that is staggering. Ancient DNA is fragile. It shatters into tiny pieces. It contaminates. It degrades to nothing, which is why for most of prehistory, the genetic record is simply blank. But the same dead, oxygen-free water that saved the brains saved the code inside them. So we can read, letter by letter, the genetics of people who died before the first word was ever written down. That should have handed us their whole family tree. The DNA said what you'd expect at first. These were the descendants of the Great Migration out of Asia, the people who came across into the Americas in deep prehistory. That part fits. That part is the story of everyone who was here before Europe arrived. But then the trail goes cold in a way I did not see coming. Because when researchers followed that genetic line forward, looking for the living end of it, for the tribe, the people, the descendants, who could stand at the edge of that pond and say those were ours, they couldn't cleanly find them. The Windover people don't map neatly onto any living Native American group, and they don't match any other known prehistoric population either. They sit apart. They are their own thing, a whole community, a whole distinct culture, with their own weaving tradition and their own burial rite and their own particular tenderness toward their dead. And as far as the genetics can tell us, no clear thread running forward to anyone walking the earth today. I want to be careful and honest here. This is what the genetic work indicates. Not a door slammed shut forever, and science can always turn up a connection tomorrow. But as it stands, they are a people who left 168 of themselves in a pond, and seemingly no one behind to remember them. Think about what that means. 168 people who loved each other enough to wrap their children's fingers for the journey, and the thread that should connect them to us just frays out somewhere in the 7,000 years between. We found them. We can read their genes, and we still can't tell you their name. Here's the last thing, and it's the one I think about when I can't sleep. They didn't dig the whole pond. Glenn Doran has said it himself. They excavated only about half of it. Roughly half of that cemetery is still in the water, right now, tonight, staked to the bottom exactly where it was placed 7,000 years ago. And they left it there on purpose. This is the part people find hard to believe, that you'd find something this extraordinary and choose to stop. But it comes straight out of the science we already talked about. The only reason any of it survived is that it never touched air. The moment this material comes up out of the oxygen-free peat and meets the atmosphere, it begins to die. Fast, within hours. The brains, the cloth, the wood, all of it. Everything that makes Windover is contingent on staying wet and staying buried. Digging it up without the ability to preserve it wouldn't be discovery, it would be destruction. So the responsible thing, really the only defensible thing, was to stop, to document what they'd learned, protect what they'd raised, and then put the water back over the rest and let it keep sleeping. They reburied the oldest cemetery in America. They made a deliberate choice to leave roughly half of a 7,000-year-old people exactly where their own descendants had placed them, and to walk away, because the ground was a better guardian than we could ever be. So this is where it actually sits, and I want you to picture it exactly. Not in a lab, not behind glass in a museum, in a pond, in a subdivision called Windover Farms, off Interstate 95, a few miles from the launch pads at Cape Canaveral, where we send human beings into space. Under that ordinary suburban water, the other half of a 7,000-year-old community is still lying in the fetal position, still wrapped, still facing north, still down there. We know they're there, and we chose to leave them. I've told you the whole thing now. The backhoe, the skulls, the 91 brains, the chemistry that explains all of it. And I still don't feel like I've solved anything, because the science answers the how, and the how was never the part that haunts me. Here's what haunts me. We can sequence their DNA, and we can't say their name. We can hold a 7,000-year-old human brain in our hands, the actual organ that did the thinking, and we will never know a single thought it had. Whether the woman with 3 necklaces was afraid at the end, what the man with the repaired spear thrower called his children, what any of them believed was waiting on the other side of that pond they were so careful to lay each other down in. And the reason it stays with me is that they were not strange. That's the whole thing. They wrapped their babies against the cold. They mended a broken tool and couldn't bear to let it go. So they gave it back to the man who'd used it. They wove cloth for no reason except that their dead should not go bare into the water. Strip away 7,000 years, and they grieved exactly the way you would, exactly the way I would. The bog kept them perfectly. It kept their bones and their cloth and their minds. It kept everything except the one thing we actually want, who they were. And maybe that's the real shape of it. Time doesn't always erase people. Sometimes it does something crueler. Sometimes it keeps them right there in front of you, close enough to touch, close enough to read their genes and count their necklaces, and tells you almost nothing. They're still in the water off I-95, and they're still waiting for someone to know them.